We want to congratulate Lakeview Cemetery Foundation and wish it continued success. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Tracy Oliver, the Director of Media and Local Affairs at Dominion East Ohio. It's my privilege to join with KeyBank Foundation in presenting Lakeview Cemetery's Black History Month lecture series. Now, this program provides a wonderful opportunity to recognize the achievements of some truly exceptional men and women as part of our Black History Month celebration. These contributions are important regionally, nationally, and internationally. Dominion sponsored this collaboration in order to provide a unique learning experience. Through this program, we are looking to raise awareness of outstanding leaders and to expose students to people whose lives were both rich and diverse. It is our hope that the hundreds of participating students will pay close attention to the traits and the innovative characteristics of these heroes. Many of their attributes, including hard work, vision, integrity, and a determined spirit, are still vital ingredients of personal and professional success. Dominion incorporates diversity and inclusion as a key component of our business as well. Making decisions based off of multiple perspectives and a range of ideas, it just makes sense. At Dominion, we follow the guiding principles of respect, fairness, and consistency to ensure that our work environment is one in which every team member feels valued so that our corporate culture can attract, develop, and retain the best and the brightest employees. So we're proud to partner with this lecture series, and we look forward to continuing to serve our employees, our customers, and students across the region. Thank you, and enjoy today's program.
And thanks again to all of our partners. For those who are watching through distance learning, a little later in the program after our speakers, you can send questions addressing their topics to townhall@ideastream.org. And I want to tell you now, so you'll be thinking about those questions and maybe get them into the email system. Again, that's townhall@ideastream.org to send us a question for distance learning. And here in the studio, you'll be able to step up to the mic when it's time for questions. Now, you may not know that today there are more than 107,000 grave sites at Lakeview Cemetery, and many of them belong to people whose names you might recognize from your history books, like the subjects of today's talk, two brothers who made history as political pioneers, Carl and Lewis Stokes. Here to tell us more is Hiram College Professor of History, Vivien Sandlund. Professor Sandlund.
Thank you very much, Dee, and I want to thank, of course, all of the sponsors, including the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation, WVIZ, the Western Reserve Historical Society, and I especially want to thank the students who are here today and who are watching through distance learning, because it's important for you to understand what people did in the past so you are able to make a life for yourselves of service and a life in which you make a difference, as the two men that we're talking about today did. They were two men who committed their lives to serving their communities and the nation. And this is 50 years ago. It was a time when, a time of great conflict. The Vietnam War was going on, great division. It was a time when African Americans in the South had only recently won the right to vote with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So putting it in that context, it was a time also of the Black Power movement was emerging. And for many, this meant winning Black political power. And both of the two men we're going to talk about today acquired political power and learned how to use it in ways that benefited everyone in their communities. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. So today we're going to talk about and pay tribute to, two of the most significant political leaders in Cleveland. They were the brothers Carl and Lewis Stokes, both of whom are buried in Lakeview Cemetery. Carl is seated and Lewis is standing in this picture. They were both Cleveland natives. Carl Stokes passed away in 1996, and Lewis Stokes passed away just 2 years ago in 2015. His funeral was a major event in this city, as residents turned out by the hundreds to honor him and remember him. Let's get this right. Now, Carl Stokes, the younger brother, is best known as the first African-American elected mayor of a large American city. from 1967 to 1971. He was more than that, though. He was also a state representative, an attorney, a news anchor in New York City briefly, and the U.S. ambassador to the Seychelles. Louis Stokes, 2 years older than Carl, was a lawyer and a congressman for 15 terms from 1968 until 1999. And during this long life of public service, he represented the poor and those in need especially. He worked for health care, for education, for civil rights, for opportunities for veterans, and for all the people of his congressional district. Now, taking you back to the beginnings, the Stokes brothers were the children of Charles and Louise Stokes, shown here. The parents were from Georgia, and they came to Cleveland in the Great Migration from the south to the north. Charles worked in a laundry, and Louise was a cleaning woman. Their first son, Louis, was born in 1925, and Carl was born 2 years later in 1927. Charles Stokes, the dad, died when Louis was 3 and Carl was an infant. You can see that there. Their mother, Louise, moved to Outhwaite Homes on East 69th Street when the boys were children. Now, Outhwaite Homes was the city's first federally funded housing project built in the 1930s. Mother Louise emphasized education for her sons. Both boys went to Central High School. Louis graduated in 1943. He entered the Army, where he served as a personnel specialist in the segregated South. He later said, "We came from Cleveland, where we were born and raised. We had never been in conditions where we were required to eat, drink, work, play, and live under segregated conditions." Now, this experience helped to fuel his desire to work for civil rights. Louis was discharged from the Army in 1946. Carl, meanwhile, dropped out of high school in 1944 and went to work briefly for TRW Products. He then joined the Army from 1944 to 1946, and then he returned home and finished high school. Louis Stokes took advantage of the GI Bill and went to Western Reserve University, and he then went on to Cleveland Marshall School of Law, where he earned his law degree in 1953. I still haven't been born yet at this time, so this is quite a while ago. Carl Stokes then went to the University of Minnesota, and then he too went to Cleveland Marshall School of Law. So we had 2 lawyers out of the same family. In 1955, Louis Stokes opened his first law firm that focused on civil rights cases. His brother Carl graduated from law school in 1956 and worked briefly as a probation officer and an assistant prosecutor, and then he became one of Louis's partners along with Norman Minor. In 1958, Carl Stokes married Shirley Edwards, who was by his side throughout his political campaign. They had 3 children, Carl Jr., Cordy, and Cordell. The couple divorced in 1973, and Carl remarried a woman named Ryja Kostadinov. They had 2 children. In 1960, Louis Stokes married Jeanette Francis, whom everyone called Jay. They had 3 children, Shelley, Angela, Lori, and Chuck. All of them went on to lead lives of service, one as a judge, one as a public affairs officer for a university library, and 2 as television journalists. In 1962, Carl Stokes ran for and was elected to the Ohio House of Representatives. He was the first Black Democrat elected to the Ohio legislature. He held this seat for 3 terms. In 1965, Stokes was approached by 2 women activists named Geraldine Williams and Jean Capers, and he was urged to run for mayor of Cleveland. In a 1988 interview, Stokes explained why he decided to run. He said that he wanted to address the deprivation suffered by Black people in Cleveland. He explained that he saw leading a major city as the next step in the civil rights struggle. Stokes also said that he thought he could win over white voters. He ran in 1965 as an independent, and not as a Democrat that time. And he was narrowly defeated by the Democratic incumbent mayor, Ralph Locher. It was the closest election in Cleveland mayoral history. Louis Stokes, meanwhile, said, "I really didn't have any interest in politics other than to help my brother since he was involved in politics. I preferred my activities as a lawyer. I was perfectly content at that." Well, that changed as a result of one of Lewis's legal cases. The state legislature had drawn the 21st congressional district so that African Americans were distributed between the districts. They call this gerrymandering if you study this. This made a victory by an African American nearly impossible. At Carl Stokes' request, the Cleveland branch of the NAACP sued the state legislature to try to force them to reorganize the district back to its original lines. And Lewis Stokes argued this case before the court. He lost, but then other lawyers appealed to the US Supreme Court and they won. The lower court decision was overturned. The district was redrawn to include 65% African Americans, which now made it possible for African Americans to win a seat. And this appeared to clear a path for, well, everybody thought it would be Carl, but he decided not to run, and so now it seemed to clear a path for Lewis Stokes to run for Congress, which he chose to do. We'll get back to that. Meanwhile, in 1967, Carl Stokes decided to run again for mayor of Cleveland, and this time he challenged Mayor Ralph Locher in the Democratic primary. Locher's administration had been tainted by something you may have heard of called the Huff Riots in 1966. So a lot of people thought Locher was not a very good mayor at that point because he hadn't been able to quell those riots. Locher also made comments that alienated African American voters. He called Martin Luther King Jr. an extremist. In an interview after the election, Stokes said that he never claimed to be able to prevent riots. But, said Stokes, the business community and many Cleveland residents thought that electing a black mayor could keep the city from going up in flames. This was happening all over the country. There had been riots all over the United States in the mid-60s. Anyway, so Stokes said that this idea that people had this wrong, what he thought was a wrong idea, that he could somehow prevent riots, along with the general disillusionment with Ralph Locher, helped Stokes to win over Democratic voters of all backgrounds. He added that he campaigned in white neighborhoods and he won support there. Despite his positive message, however, someone smashed the window of his campaign office during the campaign. On October 3rd, Carl Stokes defeated Ralph Locher in the Democratic primary. The television stations first announced that Locher had won, and it turned out they were wrong, to the amusement of Stokes and his campaign workers. Stokes, there are some pictures of this here. Stokes then faced Republican Seth Taft in the general election. Taft was the grandson of President William Howard Taft, former president. During the campaign, Stokes declared that this was the race between the grandson of a slave and the grandson of a president. In 1988, Blackside interviewed Seth Taft about the 1967 mayoral election. He said, "This campaign started because the incumbent mayor of Cleveland, Ralph Locher, was not doing a terribly good job. There'd been a great deal of unrest in the city. In 1966, we'd had some riots, and so by 1967, the incumbent mayor was in real trouble." Taft described Stokes as a good friend. He said that Stokes was very popular, a fine person. He and I had worked on legislation together in various fields like fair housing and things of that sort. Now, Taft had expected to run in the general election against Mayor Locher, and he was rather shocked when Stokes won the Democratic primary instead. Taft explained, put a picture of Taft on here. Taft explained that many white voters in Cleveland were descendants of immigrants from Eastern Europe. He noted that while they were Democrats, many from these ethnic groups were not eager to vote for a black man for mayor. Taft explained, "So right after the primary, we just had thousands of people marching into our headquarters saying, 'We want to campaign for you. We think you're the great guy.' They'd never heard of me before. We fired a whole batch of them that went out and campaigned saying, 'Hey, you wouldn't want a black mayor of this city, would you?' And we got rid of everybody we could of that sort. Frankly, both of us ran, I think, a very much affirmative, non-racially oriented campaign. But the racial issue was one postage stamp thickness below the surface. There wasn't much difference between the two of us except color." Stokes was asked whether he was surprised by the white Democratic crossover support for Taft, the Republican. Remember, these are Democrats switching to vote for the Republican. And Stokes said no, a white voter who didn't want to vote for Carl Stokes could with some security be able to vote for Seth Taft. His record in the community was an excellent one. He himself was an outstanding member of a long-time political dynasty. I was not in any kind of way surprised at the narrowness of the general election, despite the fact that the city of Cleveland is overwhelmingly Democrat. In describing his campaign in black neighborhoods, Stokes said this: "Maybe the most poignant little vignette was when we were in a motorcade coming down East 55th Street, and my wife Shirley and I were sitting on the back seat of the convertible, and a little black kid that was maybe 8 years old probably came up to us as we were stopped at a traffic signal, and he said, 'Are you Carl Stokes?' And I said, 'Yes.' And he just gave a little leap in the air and ran down the street, clapping his hands, saying, 'He's colored, he's colored, he's colored, he's colored.' I thought that sort of caught the pride and the historical aspect of the moment that I felt as I went through the black areas of the city of Cleveland." Stokes also explained that he could not run a civil rights campaign for mayor because of the racial composition of the city. He noted that the city was a little over 35% black and 65% white. He said that the campaign thus chose to put aside racial issues and run a campaign around general issues facing the city. Stokes explained that a group of leading civil rights activists had met in New York before the election, and they decided to come to Cleveland to help Carl Stokes. Stokes explained, "I had not invited anyone to come to Cleveland to help me, and I knew that if we had such a group come here with black sloganeering and whatnot, I would forget about being able to capture the needed white votes that I would have to win this election." So Stokes sent his campaign manager to meet with the civil rights leaders to urge them not to come to Cleveland, and they agreed and did not come. Stokes pointed out that his campaign accepted no help from any national organizations. The help came locally from the NAACP, the Urban League, the local black clergy, and the black newspaper, the Call-in Post. He added that Cleveland did not have a Black Panther organization, but they had a group called Black Afro-Set, which worked for the Stokes campaign. Well, the first debate between Taft and Stokes was on the east side of Cleveland, and the audience was mostly African American. Taft said that Stokes simply did a better job in this debate of introducing his family and of presenting the issues. The second debate was at John Marshall High School on the west side with an overwhelmingly white audience. Taft described a crucial moment this way: "He, Stokes, pointed his finger at me and said, 'If this man is elected mayor, it will be because his skin is white.' The whole place went kablooey. You couldn't hear a thing for 5 minutes, and Carl was trying to say, 'Hey, hey, hey,' to get attention and so forth, but he lost the audience." Now, Stokes remembered this incident differently. He said, "The debate at John Marshall High School occurred in an area of the city which is a hotbed of hostile racial attitudes. The audience that night was about 98% white. During the course of the debate, I recall saying to Seth Taft, 'Seth, you've acknowledged to me that as a Republican who doesn't even live in the city of Cleveland, that the primary thing you rely upon in being able to win this race is the fact that you're white and I'm black.' At that moment, there was a great outpouring of protest from this audience. And when the moderator was able to get them to subside a little bit, Seth Taft retorted, 'Well, well, well, Carl, so now we really have the issue out on the table. It's not fair for me to talk about race, but you can talk about it.' And then, of course, there was once again a great reaction from the white crowd. The next day, the news media focused entirely upon that reaction and termed that I had injected race into the campaign. We went back to the headquarters that night and discussed it. And we had to agree that it was an untimely remark and that the reaction we had received was one that we should have avoided by not addressing the issue. Even though the reasons for it were plausible, it just wasn't politically sound." Taft thought this might be a turning point for him to enable him to win the election. The third debate was at the City Club at the Sheraton. In that debate, Taft argued that Stokes had been absent from legislative votes 60% of the time. Carl Stokes then pulled out and read a letter from Seth Taft that said, "Dear Carl, you've done a great job down in Columbus, keep it up." And this undermined Taft's effort to portray Stokes as an absentee legislator. On election night, The vote margin was razor thin. The candidates waited until the early morning for the vote totals. Stokes described the election this way. We were at our suite in the Cleveland Sheraton Hotel on Public Square, and we watched the evening go by, getting reports. 10 o'clock came, and he was quite far ahead, and 11 o'clock came, and Taft was still ahead, and then around midnight we began closing the gap. At around 1:30 in the morning, all of our reports were in, and we were just a little bit ahead, and about a half hour later, the Board of Elections announced that all of the precincts were in, and we had won by a small margin. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Of course, we were all exhilarated. And then we went downstairs to an obviously hysterical crowd. Then we were pleasantly surprised by Seth Taft and his wife, Franny, who arrived at the celebration. Franny had a box of roses for Shirley. We had a very cordial few moments with them, appreciating Seth for the kind of positive campaign he had run. Carl Stokes won the election with 50.5% of the vote, just barely. He won barely enough votes from white people to win the election. Stokes said afterward, "My election on November the 7th, 1967 had a great deal of meaning to America because this was a city first in which the black population was a distinct minority of the city. It illustrated the ability of white people to vote for a black candidate for mayor. To black people, it introduced a whole new echelon of political power that now, instead of having to go and ask the white mayor for a job, they could go ask the black mayor and expect a job. To black civil rights people who had arrived at the summit by achieving the '64 Civil Rights Act and the '65 Voter Rights Act, this represented now the next plateau for them to arrive at, and that is involvement in the political process. The historical significance that black people in this election had indicated their involvement in climbing the ladder toward ultimate participation in the mainstream of American society. It was following the same process that had been gone through by the European immigrants that came here beginning in the 1850s, and we too would ultimately be involved in every level of political and economic power." Well, Louis Stokes, meanwhile, was continuing to work as a lawyer. He was a good friend of an activist named May Stewart, who was the sister of a man named John Terry. May Stewart asked Louis Stokes to represent her brother, who was charged with carrying a concealed weapon. Stokes went on eventually to argue the case before the U.S. Supreme Court, which is quite an honor to get to argue a case before the Supreme Court, and it proved to be a landmark ruling, Terry v. Ohio. In October 1963, a Cleveland police detective saw two men, John Terry and Richard Chilton, standing on a street corner on Euclid Avenue. The plainclothes detective thought the men's behavior looked suspicious because they were walking back and forth and pausing to look into a store window. The detective suspected the two men of planning an armed robbery. The officer then identified himself and asked the men their names. The officer spun Terry around, patted down his outside clothing, and felt for a pistol in his overcoat pocket. He removed the overcoat, took out the revolver, and ordered the men to face the wall with their hands raised. He patted down the outer clothing of Chilton and seized a revolver from Chilton's overcoat pocket. Terry and Chilton were subsequently charged with carrying concealed weapons, which is now legal, but it was illegal at the time. Terry and Chilton's defense argued in court that the search and seizure of the guns violated the men's rights under the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. The court, however, ruled that the officer had cause to believe that Terry and Chilton were acting suspiciously, that he had cause to interrogate them, and that the officer, for his own protection, had the right to pat down their outer clothing, having reasonable cause to believe that they might be armed. Terry and Chilton were found guilty. They appealed several times and failed, and then they appealed their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Louis Stokes argued before the High Court that the rights of John Terry and Richard Chilton had been violated with an unconstitutional search and seizure. Stokes lost the case. You can see what the Supreme Court ruled here. Essentially, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of what we now call stop and frisk. But it was a significant moment in Louis Stokes' career that he got to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. Let's see. In 1968, the new Cleveland mayor, Carl Stokes, moved to appoint women and African Americans to government positions. He also created an organization called Cleveland Now. This was a public and private program merged together aimed at rehabilitation of neighborhoods in the city. Local businessmen agreed to cooperate with the city in raising funds for youth activities and employment, community centers, health clinic facilities, housing units, and economic renewal projects. Well, things went well at first, and funding goals for the program were quickly met for the first few months. And then, on July 23, 1968, the Glenville shootout and subsequent riot occurred. Cleveland police had been watching a Black Power leader named Fred Ahmed Evans and his Black Power group that was called New Libya. On the evening of July 23rd, police officers and militants from Evans' group began shooting at each other in the eastern section of the Glenville neighborhood. The events of this night were kind of murky, and it was not clear who shot first. The shootout attracted a large crowd of young, angry people. And before the night was over, 7 people were dead, 3 of them Cleveland police officers, and 15 people were wounded. This is the neighborhood. When it became clear that the police were ill-equipped to handle the situation, Mayor Stokes called Governor James Rhodes to deploy Ohio National Guard troops the following day. Fred Ahmed Evans surrendered to police the next morning, but the shootout led to rioting in the Glenville neighborhood. Stokes decided to remove all white police officers from Glenville, stationing only African American police officers and community leaders in the area to prevent further rioting and to try to ease tensions. This was quite controversial. It was the first time in American history in which only African American police officers were sent in to deal with a violent riot. This is the National Guard arriving. While the police and community leaders did prevent any more deaths from occurring, there was continued looting and arson throughout the 6 square mile area. And on July 25th, more police officers and National Guard entered Glenville, and by July 28th, order was restored. The chaos, however, cost local businesses a total of $2.6 million. Fred Ahmed Evans was subsequently tried, found guilty of murder, and sentenced to death. His sentence was later commuted to life in prison. It was discovered during the trial that Evans had received over $10,000 in grant money from Cleveland Now to teach young people arts and crafts. Now, people interpreted this, a lot of people interpreted this quite negatively. They said, you know, he took this money from Cleveland Now and funded arming the militants. And Cleveland police in particular were outraged at Mayor Stokes, whom they blamed for this. They in effect blamed him for arming a Black Power activist. And in an effort to lessen the tensions between police and city leaders, Stokes agreed to establish a SWAT team to hire 500 new officers and provide them with new cruisers, and he also agreed to open a police training academy, and he encouraged the police chief to hire more African American officers. This put a dent in Stokes' reputation, but despite this, he was reelected for a second term, and Cleveland Now operated until 1970. Louis Stokes, meanwhile, had decided to run for Congress in 1968 from the 21st Congressional District of Ohio. His brother Carl gave Louis his blessing, and Louis won both the Democratic primary and the general election. His opponent in the general election was a Black Republican named Charles Lucas, the executive director of the Cleveland NAACP. Louis described Charles as a great guy. During several debates in the campaign between Lucas and Stokes, law and order emerged as a central theme, and Stokes tied Lucas to the Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon, arguing that he would not promote legislation to advance Black interests, and Stokes wound up winning 75% of the vote. This is the inauguration day. Louis Stokes became the first African-American Democrat from Ohio elected to Congress. He won all his elections by lopsided margins, sometimes winning 88% of the vote. He was elected 15 times and served for 30 years, finally retiring in 1999. This is his official congressional portrait. As a first-year representative, Stokes served on the Education and Labor Committee. He used this assignment to push for job training, economic opportunity, and educational improvement. During his second term in the House, he served on the powerful House Appropriations Committee with oversight of all federal spending bills, and he eventually served on the House Assassinations Committee. During more than 2 decades on these committees, Stokes steered hundreds of millions of federal dollars into projects in his home state of Ohio. And in 1969, Louis Stokes co-founded an important group called the Congressional Black Caucus. Carl Stokes was re-elected mayor of Cleveland in 1969. In June of that year, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. It was one of at least 13 fires on the river dating back to 1868. Environmental activists had recently been pointing to the oil that was on the surface of the river, arguing that this was a grave threat. Mayor Stokes called a news conference the day after the fire. Former Cleveland Utilities Director Ben Stefanski stood with Stokes on the banks of the Cuyahoga River after the fire and declared war on water pollution. Said Stefanski, "We didn't even realize the river had burned until the next morning when the mayor called me and we went out and looked at the site. And the real reason for all the publicity was Carl Stokes. We already had national reporters here viewing and reviewing what he was doing with the city, and it just so happened that the fire was there, and they were there, and the reporters wanted to know what he would do about stopping the pollution in the river and stopping the fires that had occurred for the last 50 years. Stefanski said that up until then, most city workers, city officials, and even the media and the public weren't that interested in air or water pollution. But he said Stokes saw the problem of pollution and understood the ramifications for the city. He also understood the possible solutions and was able to articulate this to the press and later to Congress. Even though he was not an expert on water pollution, he was the mayor of a major city that was affected by the polluted river. Time magazine described the Cuyahoga River as the river that oozes rather than flows, and in which a person does not drown but decays. The publicity about the fire did eventually spark major changes and helped to encourage the modern environmental campaigns to clean up lakes and rivers. Carl Stokes left office in 1971 after deciding not to run for a third term. He began to lecture at colleges around the country. In 1972, he became the first black anchorman in New York City when he took a job with television station WNBC-TV. While working there, he won a New York State Regional Emmy for excellence. He returned to Cleveland in 1980 and began serving as a lawyer for the United Auto Workers. From 1983 to 1994, he served as a municipal judge in Cleveland. President Bill Clinton then appointed him U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Seychelles. Stokes was awarded 12 honorary degrees, numerous civic awards, and represented the United States on numerous goodwill trips abroad by the request of the White House. In 1970, the National League of Cities voted him its first black president-elect. He was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus while serving as ambassador to the Seychelles and placed on medical leave. And Stokes returned to Cleveland in 1996 and died at the Cleveland Clinic. And as we said, he is buried at Lakeview Cemetery. His grave marker says he fought, never gave up, may never have won, but fought a good fight. The U.S. Federal Courthouse Tower in downtown Cleveland, completed in 2002, was named the Carl B. Stokes Federal Courthouse Building. There are many other buildings, monuments, and a street named for his memory within the city of Cleveland. In November 2006, the Western Reserve Historical Society opened an exhibit titled Carl and Louis Stokes, From Projects to Politics, focusing on the brothers' early life at the projects, service in World War II, and eventual rise to politics. The exhibit ran until September 2008. Louis Stokes had a distinguished career as a congressman, serving for 30 years. He served on the House Appropriations Committee. He was particularly interested in veterans issues, and he secured funds for health care facilities for veterans in Cleveland. In the 1970s, he served as chairman of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, charged with investigating the murders of President John Kennedy and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. He served on the House committee that investigated the Iran-Contra affair, which you may have read about in history class. As chairman of the House Ethics Committee, Stokes oversaw the investigation of a corruption scandal known as Abscam in 1979 and 1980, which eventually led to convictions of 1 senator and 6 House members. He was awarded the Congressional Distinguished Service Medal. At the time of his retirement from the House, he ranked 11th in seniority out of 435 House members. And after his retirement, he didn't give up. He continued to practice law, and he joined the faculty of Case Western Reserve University's Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. He retired from law practice in 2012, and in 2015, he announced that he was ill with brain and lung cancer. And he passed away on August 18th, 2015, at home. Louis Stokes was 90 years old, and he too is buried in Lakeview Cemetery. Many buildings around the nation are named in honor of Louis Stokes. Upon his death, Cleveland Marshall College of Law posted this message on its website. Throughout his life, he exemplified the law school's motto, "Learn law, live justice." During a storied and iconic career, Stokes was a champion for social and economic justice, education, health care, and other causes that had a lasting positive impact on the lives of many. U.S. Attorney Stephen Dettelbach described him during the Abscam trial of 1979 like this: "We were in the midst of a huge corporation scandal, and public service was taking a public beating, but Lou Stokes was there as a shining example of integrity, excellence, and most important of us, for all of us, of justice." Go back one more. Toward the end of his life, Louis Stokes had a message for young people today. He said, "They are the brightest young people in the world today. They are brighter than Carl Stokes. They are brighter than Louis Stokes. And that says to me that with the opportunities today, with the barriers that have been shut down, that in this day and age they have every opportunity if they apply themselves to be whatever they want to be." Thank you.
Thanks again to Professor Vivien Sandlund. And you'll be able to ask questions of the professor in just a few moments. And if you have some in our distance learning, remember the email address is townhall@ideastream.org. So send those questions, townhall@ideastream.org. First, though, we're going to hear from Susan Hall, who's Director of Community Relations for the Western Reserve Historical Society. Susan has brought with her some special items that'll tell us more about the lives of Carl and Louis Stokes. Susan?
Again, good morning. I have the privilege of knowing both Carl and Louis Stokes and having worked with them in many capacities, particularly Louis Stokes on his autobiography and as a curator at Western Reserve Historical Society, now called the Cleveland History Center, on 2 exhibits. One that opened, as Professor Sandlund said to you, in 2006, and a new one that will open this fall in November. And this year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the election of Carl Stokes to mayor of Cleveland, the first African-American mayor of a major American city. And in order to get elected, you need things, you need stuff. And it's no different today than it was then. You'll see billboards and radio and TV advertisements and bus wraps and buttons. People are still wearing buttons. And so I brought with you some original pieces that were from their campaigns. The first one on the top, the little one, is actually a hologram. So depends on which way you look at it. It shows Carl Stokes' image, and then it says "Go Stokes." The other is Louis Stokes' campaign button. There were some that actually had Stokes in red, but most of the time their colors seem to be orange. So the Cleveland Now button was also worn to support the Cleveland Now campaign that you just heard about, in addition to the elections. So there were small ones, there were large ones, they had big banners that were around the city and at different places. The one in the center, actually, I don't know if any of you know who Flip Wilson was. He was a comedian. And at the time, there was a big event here, and Carl Stokes invited him to come and speak. In his comedy, he was kind of like Tyler Perry today. He could play a Medea role. So his character was Geraldine. So he came as a guest, and during the dinner, he spoke as Flip Wilson, the comedian, and then he went into his Geraldine type character as part of the performance during the dinner as entertainment. But that centerpiece, the white and orange one, it says, "It's about time." And it was actually a campaign fundraiser, and that was a coaster. Many of us don't use them anymore, but they were to put on the table. Everyone got one as a gift as they left, to put your glass on to keep rings from and the water from spilling or causing marks on your tables. So we have tens of those still left over. The bottom one is an actual bumper sticker that was from his second campaign. And as you see, I'm wearing a scarf at the time. We're still wearing them now. Most of them tend to curve and twist and flip over themselves, but women have been wearing scarves for decades. So this is a replica of an original that was from 1967, but it's already old too, because this was from the exhibit. It was given as a gift to all of the attendees of the gala opening, and it's complete with Carl's signature. And it was pretty popular at the time. We have another one in our collection from Hubert Humphrey, who was running for president. His colors were white and green, but this made people walking billboards to support candidates. So these are the type of things that we have in our collection, in addition to thousands of letters, documents, videos, audio, and many of the photographs that you saw in the presentation just before this.
And thanks again to Susan Hall. And what happens now, students, is that you get a chance to ask questions about Carl and Louis Stokes and the times in which they lived and what they accomplished. And if you have a question here in the studio, you can step up to the microphone that is right there. And once again, if you're watching through distance learning, you can send a question by email. The address is townhall@ideastream.org. And Professor Sandlund, if you could come back up to...
We're both coming up.
and Susan Hall. So we have a questioner at the mic. Great.
You can hear me? You can hear me?
Yes, speak
All
up
right.
just a little bit. Oh, great.
How would the Stokes brothers tell us to my bad, I'm nervous. How would the Stokes brothers tell us to act during adversities and hardships? How would they tell us
How
to
does
act?
the story of the Stokes brothers tell us to act?
Exactly.
How would they tell us to act during adversities and hardships?
I think they wanted people to be strong and to maintain hope and to rely on the community. I mean, they really worked for the community. Their interest was in the community. And so to rely on each other. And I think that would be the message that they would have, that, work with others who are your family, but beyond your family, your whole community, and support one another.
Thank you. I have one more question. How would
I have an answer to your question. I know that he's told this to many students. I've witnessed him tell this, but he would tell you the same thing his mother told he and his brother: to get an education. That's how you make a difference. To work with your head and not just with your hands, and to persevere through that, because that'll take you to new and lofty heights. So you figure during the time that they were born pre-Depression, they went to World War II, came out and used, as Dr. Sandlund told you, the GI Bill. They went to college. She thought that the highest that they would achieve was high school. And they pushed through past high school and have college degrees, and they both had law degrees. And that's what he and his brother would encourage you to do, to further your education and your passion to make a difference.
And out of that whole story that you told us, what would you say was their most challenging hardship or adversity?
They were born into poverty, number one. Their father died when they were little boys. They had no recollection of him. But they had a strong family. Their grandmother came from the South to help raise them, while their mother was a live-in domestic. So the community in which they lived in at Outhwaite Homes was comprised of families and other people that looked out for each other. So the hardship and adversity first was poverty and then racism in America, but they overcame those obstacles to do great things through education and service to their community.
All right, one
And
more.
people working together.
All right, and I know that the story touched me and inspired me, but what do you say inspired you the most about his story? Yeah, either one.
Go ahead again.
What inspired me most is that they were regular people. They were part of the fabric of this community. You could reach out and talk to them, touch them. They were not celebrities, as we often see sometimes with politicians in America. They were not off limits, especially Louis Stokes, who would speak to groups of students, invite them to his office, invite them to Washington. He was a professor at Case Western Reserve University, and he didn't run from coming from the projects and telling that story that you too can, as his mother said, and he would repeat, be somebody. So what inspired me is that he was not untouchable and unavailable. He was a father, a husband, a grandfather, and he spoke of that often, and he treated me as if I was one of his children as well. And if he were alive and standing here today, he would have a big grin on his face, happy to share his life story and to hear more about what you want to do with your life.
Thank you.
More questions from the audience here? And we don't have any emails yet, so I have a question for both of you that plays on the education piece, because we know from their own lives that education was important to Carl and Louis Stokes. So what have you seen that tells you that they wanted to make it a priority for other young people, for other generations coming up? What sorts of actions did they take to support quality education?
Well, Louis Stokes certainly worked for legislation to support education and to bring money into Cleveland to support the schools and to support education, and to fight poverty, and also to promote students from all backgrounds being able to get higher education. And that was one of his big commitments in his life. Carl, of course, one of the pieces of Cleveland Now, one of its goals was to provide money to assist students with education and to promote education. So both of them took concrete steps in that direction. And they also spoke actively to encourage young people, because they knew how important encouragement and hope and belief in oneself was. And they had the courage to go out and not be afraid to achieve a higher education, and also to serve the public in very visible leadership positions, and they were thus a model for young people.
Congressman Stokes served as a professor at the Mandel School at Case Western Reserve. He also mentored young lawyers, young attorneys as they came out of law school and came into the firm. And often, after a museum was dedicated to him at Outhwaite, he would take them on tours of where he used to live and the museum, and talk to them about his life, his brother's life, and the community of which he emanated from, and how he didn't set out to become a congressman. He wanted to be a lawyer. He was comfortable and happy achieving that goal, but things changed. Life changed for him, and 30 years later, he was a congressman. So he took the time, as Dr. Sandlund has said, to spend time with students, to embrace students, to be available to students, and celebrate students' achievements as well as his own.
Well said.
I have another thought. I think sometimes people that go into politics are sneered at. You know, we say, oh, they're politicians. These two men were political leaders. They went into politics because they cared about people in their communities and they wanted to make a difference. And I hope that many of the people in this audience or participating through distance learning will think about this and decide to go into politics. That doesn't mean everybody has to do that, but I think this is a way to make a real difference in people's lives, and we see that in the accomplishments of both of these men. It wasn't easy to be mayor of Cleveland during this very divided, contentious time. I mean, the police were angry, there were white people that were angry, the city council was angry, and yet Carl Stokes persevered and worked for the betterment of everyone. And Louis Stokes worked in Congress and used his power to benefit people not only in his district but all over the country. And so I think it's important not to put down politicians. These are examples of men who were politicians who were really exemplars of civic virtue.
No one else at the microphone right now, so I have another question. And we'll start with Susan and then come back. The Stokes brothers were trailblazers in a lot of areas in their lives. Carl, the first black Democrat in the legislature, the first black mayor of a major American city. Louis, the first black congressman from Ohio. What do you think prepared them to be the kinds of leaders that they were?
Well, some of their early influences were Joe Louis, the famous boxer, as well as Jesse Owens. They were young people when they were accomplishing and achieving their great things in their given sport, one as a boxer and the other as a track star. And then it was John O'Holly. The post office right now, for people who are sitting right here on Orange Place, is named after John O'Holly, but most of us don't know who he is. John O'Holly was the founder of the Future Outlook League. And Carl worked for him one of his early jobs as a driver. Well, John O'Holly's Future Outlook League was an early economics, not just civil rights organization. And that's what fueled a lot of their passion, because they had examples of people in the community who were fighting for equity, for justice. And the Future Outlook League's equity and justice mission was about getting jobs and not just having a job and you could spend your money in your neighborhood, but you couldn't work there. From the banks to the Central Market that used to be at 55th and Woodland, all the way to the telephone company. You could have a telephone, but you could pay your bill, but you couldn't get a job as an operator. So they did early protests, and this was in the 30s. And these type of campaigns were actually happening throughout the country, not just in Cleveland, but it was a very organized group. They had articles of incorporation. They had civil disobedience, if you will, by protest, not violence. So it wasn't about a nonviolent moment, but they would picket in front of Central Trust and say, we put our money here, but we can't get a job here. So those are the people that Carl and Louis Stokes were watching, amongst many others, as young people.
And we have less than a minute left, but if you want
Well,
to...
I'll just sum up. I think those influences showed them that every person can make a difference, that every life matters, that every person can change the world. Indeed, I think every person does change the world, but in a focused way and in a way that really made a difference to many people. That's why we celebrate them 50 years later.
Thank you both. Well said. And thank you all for being a great audience. Next week on Tuesday, February 28th, we'll present the final program in this special Black History Month series from Lakeview Cemetery Foundation. And that program will focus on the writer Charles Chesnutt and his daughter Helen Chesnutt. And for today, thank you to all the students and all the partners who made this event possible. Enjoy your lunch and travel safely. Well done. Yeah.